Hey everyone, I kind of wanted to do a quick post. Well, this will not be a quick video. I shouldn't say quick. Do a post mortem on set 5.5 for TFT, and kind of give some of my thoughts on to what was added in 5.5, what changed, systems, just kind of an overarching thing. Go through some of the more popular compositions that came up during the set, so on and so forth. So I'm gonna kind of just get in there. So to start off, there were three major changes with the set mechanically. The Radiant items, the Divine Blessing, and the addition of the Tome of Emblems, which is a little more minor. The big things were Radiant items and the Divine Blessing. So the Radiant items themselves was a significant improvement over Shadow. I think this was like kind of an obvious answer to this question. Radiant items, significantly better system than Shadow items. Shadow items was overly complex. It didn't make a lot of sense to people, made a lot of suboptimal builds. There was a lot of combination of items that wouldn't be obvious to like a standard player of TFT, but if you were a pro, you knew that like, the combination of this item and this champion totally busted and completely warped the actual game at higher levels, while at the lower levels people were just combining items that didn't make any sense and just like killed their own comp. There was to put it simply, there was too much knowledge that was needed for set 5 to work. But for 5.5, they changed it. They went to Radiant items. Radiant items you got exactly one of until we got to the later part of the set. You got exactly one of, and it was strictly better than the base version of that item. Strictly better. It was an easy win. I'll go through. I think I'll go through some of them to point out which ones I think were probably most notable. But in general, this was a free win. This was just great. This was a great idea. Whoever put this idea in, just give them a raise right now because it was simple, it was elegant, and it worked out very well. Divine Blessing. So I really wasn't that high on Divine Blessing when it first came out. It kind of reminded me of like what that thing everyone got in Festival, the award achievement thing in Festival of Beasts for set 4.5. It just kind of like felt like a little tack on that really didn't do much to the game. I was very wrong on that. Divine Blessing actually ended up being very, very interesting mechanically because it made like lost streaking and running your way down to 40 to high roll to see if you can high roll something good out of this very good, very strong. Because then you could go down the 40, hit your Divine Blessing, and then run back to the top of the leaderboard after a roll down. Like most of the time in your Divine Blessing was a pile of gold. There were other things you can find, but in general, what you had was a pile of gold. Pile of gold is worth a lot. You can level harder. You can do a significant roll down. Like that's worth a lot. Um, and a lot of the game kind of started to, as people kind of understood that, it revolved a lot more around the Divine Blessing. The people who high rolled the game ended up taking a ton of damage to people who low rolled when you get past this point. While at the same time, the people who high rolled could have knowledge of what was in the Divine Blessing and play around it to have a better end game comp than people who had just took damage the entire time they hit their Divine Blessing. I, I I really like this. Was actually a comeback mechanic that I think worked very well in the game for pretty much everyone involved. Um, so while originally, like I said, I wasn't particularly high on this mechanic, this actually had a lot of mechanics behind it that you had to think about and play around. So I'll give this the check mark. I still like think technically, like from like a gameplay standpoint, as a comeback mechanic inherently like feels bad, man, because it's not rewarding the better player, but it makes the game more interesting in ways. Um, to kind of use a comparison that probably doesn't compare very well, it's comparable to Smash Bros. So in Smash Bros, you had the rage mechanic, and you have it in Tekken as well, but Tekken it functions a bit differently. Um, as you take more and more damage, your attacks launch further and further as you take damage. So it's not just like your opponent takes damage. As you take damage, you launch them further and further. this is a mechanic that benefits higher weight characters because they're harder to knock off, so they'll get to a higher percentage than, say, a very lightweight character like Fox, for example. So this kind of functions like that, but not exactly in that the rage mechanic, who it benefits will vary based on what is actually within the Divine Blessing. And you don't know until someone gets to 40. So if you go all the way down to 40, you're taking a chance that you might not get something that's useful here. But if you still play a very strong early game and get to a high life total and hit this later, then you know what's in it and you can play around it. So there's actually a good bit of thought going in here. You really do need to know what's in. You need to play around to understand what's in the Divine Blessing because there's a lot of value in that knowledge. But I liked it. As I played it more, I just kind of think it would be better off if it didn't come back for a while. Unlike Radiant items could come back tomorrow, and I'd be so happy about that. Divine Blessing is something that I'd like to see later, but maybe not like instantly. Toma Emblems was a little more minor thing. Spat items have always kind of like randomized spat items have always kind of been like a little bit of an issue. So getting to select from 4 instead of just taking a spat item is a lot more interesting to me as a player. I can better play around that rather than being forced down this awkward path by this odd emblem that I had. So it's just kind of a mechanical improvement in the game that gives more player agency rather than like forcing you to go a particular way. Which was a big theme in this set, was doing things that added more player agency. They added some traits. I'll talk through the traits later. I'll talk through the traits later. But in general, I don't think the Cannoneer and Sentinel really weren't that interesting in the end. But we'll go through them later. Same thing with the champions. I think we can probably... Now, what was removed? The only thing that I was kind of upset was removed was Kindred. Kindred and, like, Pantheon, Trundle. Dragon Slayer, yeah. Losing Dragon Slayer and losing Kindred, I think, was probably a mistake. I think I liked those champions a lot. I thought they brought a lot to the game. Particularly the Dragon Slayer trait was a really cool trait, and Kindred was a really cool champion for, like, just pure utility purposes. So it was kind of miffed they left, but the set still played pretty well. I'm curious what the set would have looked like if Kindred stayed in. I think that it was possible for Kindred to stay in and just have another Ranger, but well, they added Action, so whatever. Yeah, I'll quickly go through the Radiant items. Some of them were more interesting than others. Most of them were just like, this is strictly better than the base one, so you should take it if you wanted the base one. But there were others that were like doing additional things that were kind of warping the game a little bit. Archangel Staff really wasn't doing much different from regular. Radiant Archangel Staff wasn't really doing that much. Now, Blessed Bloodthirster was doing a bit more. So this shield that people were getting was actually pretty busted. The shield people got from Blessed Bloodthirster made this one of the best items in the game. It was really bad. I don't know what else to say. It was kind of crazy how good this item was. Blue Blessing, I don't think anyone really found a point where Blue Blessing was like that much better than regular blue buff. Rose Thorn Vest, yeah, it was a bramble, but it was a better bramble. There really wasn't an issue with taking it. The biggest advantage, and you'll notice it for a lot of the defensive items, they added health regen on pretty much all of them, and some of them it was too strong, way too strong. I think they ended up toning it down on pretty much all of them, but some of them, I think particular the Radiant Sunfire Cape got kind of crushed. Chalice, I never really saw anyone take Chalice. I think the spell vamp simply like wasn't enough. I never really saw it that much. Deathblade, this was just Deathblade on crack. It really didn't change how... You almost would still rather have IE. Dragon's Will, kind of the same thing with Rosethorn Vest. It was really strong because of the health regen. Radiant Frozen Heart was busted. I would argue that this was probably the second, maybe third. I'll go with third. Third best Radiant item in the set. And not enough people picked it up. This item was actually ridiculous. 2 hexes by 50% plus 30 starting mana. This thing was absurd. I don't even know what to say. It was just that good. Stoneplate, the health regen on this was way too high. If your last champion had Radiant Stoneplate, you couldn't kill it. It was unkillable. It had too much health and it had too much armor and magic resist, while at the same time this absurd health regen. Demon Slayer, very underrated item. This was actually a very good item. First, 80%. That's one-shotting. That's one-shotting. Trust when I say this is one-shotting. And the 1400 health, while that seems kind of high, and while it is, that's most 4 costs at 2-star. It's most 4 costs at 2-star and pretty much all of your front lines at 2-star, I believe. At the same time, it's a hard 40% damage increase. Just straight hard 40% damage increase. This was a very good item. Super utility. You could always take and put on anything. Guardian Archangel, I don't think was great until you hit the Radiant bonus. Once you hit the Radiant bonus, it was a good item. But if you didn't hit the Radiant bonus, it wasn't that good an item. Ginsu's Rageblade. It's better than a Rageblade, but I don't think it was better than a Rageblade that much. In general, you took it when you had a build that required a Rageblade, like Rangers. Pretty much, Rangers always needed a Rageblade. So if you didn't have a Rageblade and you hit a Rageblade on the Armory, you would just take Rageblade there. Fist of Paramis was the best Radiant item in the game. It just was. No, really, it just was. This was the best Radiant item in the game. It was completely... you got both of these. This was the best item in the game. 40% of damage dealt. It's ridiculous. Hexagon Lifeblade never really got a chance to see the light of day. Part of it was because I think the set was way too AD heavy. Particularly in the later half of the set, there just weren't enough AP champions to carry the load, particularly when Karma kind of fell off the wagon. But I like the idea here. There just wasn't enough AP to go around to make this useful. Zenith Edge, yeah, this was just a pure damage item, not much to say here. I think this actually got nerfed on Covalescent Spark. Covalescent Spark was a pretty good item. It wasn't a great item, but it was a pretty good item. If you had like a shit armory, you could take this and be pretty much okay with it and fine. But the health regen on it was pretty handy. Glamorous Gauntlet, it's dual gauntlet. Just you do more crit strike damage. It's dual gauntlet. To be honest, if you pick this, it was probably a mistake. There was probably better things you could do, and it was easier just to make a Jewel Gauntlet. So unless your build actually needed a Jewel Gauntlet, you probably didn't take this. Kind of the same thing with Eternal Whisper. Eternal Whisper was pretty much in the same boat. If you wanted a Last Whisper, you just made a Last Whisper. This really wasn't that much better than a Last Whisper. Locket. Locket was interesting because Locket got reworked a couple times. I think it was one of the worst performing Radiant items. I don't think it was a very good item. I don't think a lot of people used it or had a lot of love for it. The problem with Radiant Locket is Locket in general is a good early game item and a terrible late game item. So by the time you had your Radiant Armory, you were kind of already past the point where a Locket was a good item. And you didn't really want to see it again. So, not great. Not what you really wanted. More Morello. Yeah, Morello serves pretty much the same purpose here. I'm not quite sure if you really needed more of it here. Pardon my pun. Quicksilver, underrated item, actually. This was actually a pretty good item that people didn't make because oftentimes you had a better item that you would rather have. Uh, it's a good item, though. Just part of the problem is a lot of the CC in the set didn't come until, like, the end, or it wasn't really there until the end game. Most of your CCers that you saw in the late game, like Iron and Volibear, just, like, didn't exist until you got near the end game. So taking a quickest silver out of the 3/6 was usually not particularly useful, but it was still a good item, particularly because of this attack speed buff. Death cap, it's death cap. If you scale off AP, this was an okay item to take. I think I'd have to think on this, but I suspect that this was probably better than taking Jewel Gauntlet in most cases, Radiant Jewel Gauntlet in most cases. There's probably a line for various champions where it was better to take Death Cap over Jewel Gauntlet. I think probably my greatest example of a ridiculous Jewel Gauntlet keep was I had a Radiant Death Cap on a Yasuo that was doing like 1500 damage on autos. That was pretty cool. Just because of how the AP scaling on his ability. It was pretty cool. Rapid Fire Light Cannon. Yeah, this was actually a very, very good item because of this line. RFC has always kind of been in a weird place in this game because when you see it, it kind of seems like a pretty useless item. Like, you just increase your range by 2. But what's not realized is that the movement AI in this game is kind of absurd with some of the dumb shit it does. And that when you put this on a melee champion, it 100% fixes that dumbass AI from doing stupid shit. So you end up with stuff that just keeps attacking rather than spending half the battle moving around the map like an idiot. So when you combine this range boost along with this attack speed boost, this item was very good. I wouldn't be surprised in the future if we have Rapid Fire Cannon kind of keep a smaller version of this attack speed boost. Kind of like what's being done with Quickest Silver. If you haven't seen the new Quicksilver, it has an attack speed boost. I think that's actually like a really good buff to put on that item, so that way you're not just putting something that prevents CC, but actually something that makes you stronger. Radiant Redemption. This was actually like probably the best defensive item in the game for a time. I think they've nerfed these numbers multiple times. I don't know why they made this 2 bolts. This is 2 bolts. They put 2 bolts in this game. Fires a bolt in there. Oh, why does it only say 1? I guess they must have. Did they change that later? Huh. I think they did change this. So originally this was 1 bolt that did 110% damage. Oh, and applied on hit effects. I know that was something they worked with. Taking that away later on, and I know the new Hurricane doesn't do it either. But they changed this eventually to be 2 bolts, which was pretty useful. Hurricane's kind of been in a weird place in my opinion because it's a very, very hard attack damage boost that people don't really notice how strong it is, particularly when your champion gets stuck on a frontliner. This Hurricane Bolt just keeps pecking away at the backline while you're stuck pecking away at this tank that won't die. So you're still getting value out of being stuck on a frontliner. People really underestimate that part of Hurricane, and it's not surprising that we've seen Hurricane kind of go up and down throughout its existence. Shroud, good item. Spear, I don't think this was ever a good item. I think this was always pretty much a terrible item. Same thing with Static. I think Static was probably one of the worst ones in the game. It's just Static just functions so poorly between the items it requires and like what it does. Like, you're getting a magic resist debuff on auto attacks. It just doesn't synergize right. Sunlight Cloak. Yeah, this was nerfed before. I think this was like 2% before, and this did so much damage on frontline. Yeah, I don't know what to say. Wrathful Gloves. So this was one of the best items, but I never felt like at a point I got a combination of items that was completely busted, which is probably a credit to Riot when they curated the list of items that you can get off this to make it sure that you're not gonna like completely blow something up. So while this still was one of the best items, you didn't get combos that were just a game ending, which was probably useful. Titan's Vow, eh. I don't have much else to say about Titan's Vow. Like it's not a bad item. It's just not a great item. Banshee Silence is probably the best, second best, third best. It's up there. One of the best items in the game. It's actually ridiculous what this could do on a composition. If you saw this and you like in general, if you saw this in Fist of Fairness, depending on what you already made, you might just take this instead. And Fist of Fairness is definitely the best rating item in the game. Banshee Silence was ridiculous, and the way they changed Trap Claw made Trap Claw very good, and keep sticking with that and keeping that on Banshee Silence and giving it your whole thing. Oh, this was a ridiculous item. It was so absurd. Um, I have a lot of games where I won, and I just kind of looked at what happened across that final fight, and was like, I won because I had a Banshee Silence that blocked like half my opponent's abilities. Warmog, yeah, it's Warmogs. Zeke's Harmony, I never really saw anyone make this, which is kind of interesting. That I would never see this. Yeah, I don't know. Like, just people didn't buy this, didn't take this off the armory, and it's not a bad effect. This is a pretty strong effect. I think in the end, what kind of the issue here is that you're giving it to you're giving this attack speed boost to like 3 different champions, but your comp is really gonna only ever have maybe 2 champions that actually need it, and you're only gonna really itemize one by 3/6. So it's just kind of awkward, I guess. Minstrel, 10 seconds is a long time. 10 seconds is so long. It's so long. Um, yeah, I'm happy to see this go. People took this, and if they hit you, like, you just felt completely dead. But if they miss you, like, this was a dead item. Um, I usually avoided taking this because it was just so awkward. ZZ Rot. I don't think this ever really was useful. I think this was actually pretty bad. I'm not surprised that they've been reworking this, but a lot of the problem with ZZ Rot in general right now is that bows were very sought out for in 5.5. Everyone kind of wanted a bow for their build, so to take a bow and waste it to make a ZZ Rot, alright, let's move on. Talk about the traits and origins throughout 5.5. A-Bomb. A-Bomb got reworked a whole bunch of times. Um, I think in general, one of the bigger problems with A-Bomb was it was never really useful to play 4 because Kalista just kind of became awkward. There just wasn't anything you could do, so you would always carry 3, and then you would hit Fiddle, and then drop Kalista instantly, and play an actual comp with A-Bomb. So I don't think we ever got to a point where 4 A-Bomb was actually strong enough to keep Kalista around. Uh, to be honest, I think A-Bomb could have benefited from one more champion with the A-Bomb trait, and then rescale these numbers accordingly. But we never got there. Dawnbringer, I never really liked Dawnbringer as a trait. It had its usefulness in that the same thing. We'll talk about Nightbringer later, where you couldn't get one shot. It would just trigger this heal. That was usually the most useful part of this, but like only having this 10% damage bonus really weakened this trait a lot. So all you really did was just like lose half your health and then instantly reheal. That's all this trait really ever did. Draconic. Uh, Draconic never really paid off the way Fortune did, and I think it kind of suffered from that. I think a lot of these traits really, these kind of like chase, RNG heavy, luck based traits, like they never, they're all going to be compared to Fortune, and this was not Fortune. It wasn't at all. And it didn't play like it. It was kind of terrible in Hyper Roll if you ever played it in Hyper Roll. It just didn't work out. Forgotten. So there was all sorts of different Forgotten builds throughout this set. But I'm not going to like focus on one of them because I'll get into compositions later. What I kind of want to focus on is talking a little bit about Viego and how Viego's scaling in Forgotten kind of is out of control. Viego's scaling in general was out of control for a lot of this set. And maybe I'll talk more about Viego later, but he had so many different levers that he could scale off of. It was kind of ridiculous. But I think overall the biggest issue with Forgotten was that there were 3 carries, but none of the compositions were like particularly great at any point in time in the game. Just overall. So you had Vayne Carry, you had Misfortune Carry, and you had Draven Carry. Now, all of them would only ever play 4 Forgotten. None of them ever got up to 6. But at the same time, like none of them were particularly dominating or particularly great in the set. Maybe Misfortune at one point. We had all of these good champions in Forgotten, but it was just kind of odd. We never really had a big like win con with it. Maybe that's a good thing that it was like that, to be honest. But I think like just the fact that it just didn't it never really added up the way I felt like it should. Hellion. Hellion was, how do I want to put this? I like the idea. I just think the scaling was off for a lot of the set. Like this attack speed scaling, I think for a lot of the set it was probably off, and it probably has more to do with it going from a 3-5-7 to a 2-4-6-8. And figuring out how the scaling was supposed to go off, that just felt awkward. I do also think that one of the things they probably should have looked at was when the Hellion dies, if the doppelganger probably should have come back with like items or item components of the champion that you had before. I think that would have made it a little more interesting. That's just my opinion. I'll skip talking about Gwen. Ironclad. Ironclad was ridiculous. I mean, I don't even want to talk about Ironclad because of how dumb Ironclad was. Like, if you were against an AD comp and you ran 3 Ironclad, it was a free win. It was straight up free. Last Whisper was required on pretty much every single AD composition in the game because Ironclad existed. In the future, I hope that if we get in a trait like Ironclad, it doesn't go all allies gain armor and it's just Ironclad champions gain armor. Because this, giving armor to all of the champions, especially on champions that were all like very playable and very good, just it became a problem. It's not like Mystic, where all the Mystic champions just provide utility. Like, these are legitimate frontline champions that you just play in every comp anyway. Nightbringer. I love Nightbringer. I'm going to be honest. I love the Nightbringer trade. It's very rare you saw anyone get up to 6, but I would kind of regularly get up to 6. For Nightbringer, a 60% shield is absurd. It's so good. And what's really nice, this isn't even that hard to hit. You have Diana, you have Aphelios, you have Lee Sin, and you have Sedge. That's 4 you can play in a lot of compositions. Or if you're playing a Yasuo comp, you have Diana, you have Yasuo, you have Lee Sin, you have Sejuani. It was just so easy to play 4. The fact that you couldn't get one shot as a Nightbringer because it would just trigger the shield, it's awesome. Plus his damage boost was insane. So I like to compare Nightbringer to Dawnbringer, and in general, I always felt Nightbringer was better, mostly because of this damage boost. just being significantly higher. If Aphelios cast while this damage boost was active, it would just instant kill. He just killed 3 champions. It was that easy. It was ridiculous. Where at the same time, the advantage that Dawnbringer had was that this went to health. So you got to keep this, whereas the shield was just temporary. It usually didn't matter though, because you had the shield for 8 seconds. You just ran over everything with this damage boost in 8 seconds. So I really did like this trait, despite the fact I don't think a lot of people actually thought it was that interesting or thought it was really that good. I played it a lot. I thought it was good. I'd like to see it again. Redeemed. So now with Redeemed, we're getting to this point where we start noticing a lot of these traits, all they're really doing is adding stats that scale upwards. They're not like doing very interesting things. And that was kind of one of the main negative things about this set, was we had too many traits that weren't like doing something interesting, but instead just increased stats. So there wasn't a lot of like power fantasy going on. It was just like RPG stat numbering and just becoming stronger units in general, rather than making big booms and violent explosions everywhere. But in general, Redeemed, you get big stats. What I was gonna say. I do think 3 Redeemed was kind of obnoxiously weak. I don't think 3 Redeemed was very good at all. Whereas 6 Redeemed, you got the 60 ability power that was actually really handy. I think 3 Redeemed was pretty useless. I don't even know. I don't even think it should have existed. You might as well just not have anything. Revenant. I hope we never see Revenant again. I honestly mean that. Revenant. I thought Revenant was kind of just like abysmal to have to deal with and watch. So you'd kill a Vola Bear before he ults. He would die, res, which functioned as a de-aggro, do 1 auto, and then ult on your entire team. It was so hard to just stop them from killing you. From making their effect and blowing up the battlefield on you. It was just really annoying. I really hope we do not see Revenant again. It was not a good trait. Sentinel. So here's my thing with Sentinel. I think if Sentinel was a very minor trait, where it was like a 2/4 with a very small version of these effects, I think it would have been cool and interesting in the early game. But this came out as like a big trait. And this attack speed combined with this targeted shield effect was a little bit too strong, I think. And also not overly interesting. I think also this trait kind of lacked interesting carries to play throughout the mid game. None of these 2-cost, 3-costs they're all utility. They don't actually carry. So your carries here were Olaf, Lucian, and Action. So you'd stack items on the Olaf, and you'd have to hold the Olaf with items until you found Lucian. And I've always thought that was kind of awkward, not having a mid-game carry for the Sentinel trait. It just felt off to me. Classes, Assassin never changes. Brawler, I wish they had kept the AD bonus on Brawler. I think it would have been a much more interesting trade, particularly with Set. I think Set had a chance to actually be a decent hero if they had the AD buff, and they didn't. On a positive side, adding Sejuani as a brawler, I think, was actually a very good move, and I really liked Sejuani being added as a brawler. It opened up a lot more compositions that you can play for front lines, and even just running a Nightbringer carry with a bunch of brawlers felt really good. Cannoneer, so here's Cannoneer had a kind of a functional design issue here. you had these 4 champions, but that and this trait kind of scales off AD, but you really only had one champion that scaled heavily off AD. All of these other champions, you'd rather have a Jewel Gauntlet. Jewel Gauntlet was probably their best item. Even Lucy, even after the nerfs to Lucian's spell damage, Jewel Gauntlet was probably still one of his best items. It probably had changed to Hodge, Hands of Justice, and I guess Giant Slayer. But one of his best items was still Jewel Gauntlet. So you have all of this scaling, all of these like buffs to the trait that scale off AD, and only one champion does damage off AD. It didn't synergize right. So oftentimes what this set just ended up being, it was kind of just a bunk set. And all of the set really did was just enable Lucian to blow things up. And that was it. Caretaker, we'll talk about the 5 costs later. Cavalier. Cavalier was inspired design. Inspired. Not only was it a good frontline trait, it was a good frontline trait that blew up movement AI. It actually made movement AI make sense in some manner. As soon as they made it so that assassins jumped first again, which I feel like is something they need to do every single set, is make assassins jump first. So that way, like, these actually work. But also because there was a Cavalier spat, you got some like really interesting carries. I don't know if you've ever seen a Cavalier Jax or Cavalier Yasuo. They're very good. They're very, very good. Or Cavalier Lee Sin, great frontline unit. Um, yeah, this was actually really interesting, and I really did like this design and how it played out throughout the set. Invoker. Anytime I played 4 Invoker, I never felt like it was great. 2 Invoker was always fine, but 4 Invoker was just never felt great. All these champions kind of benefit, well, except for maybe Ivern. All these champions benefit well off it. It just never felt like a great like trait that you would just like insta carry. It just kind of like felt like a tack on that you always just kind of added on to it to make it better. You make your comp better. Like if you could play 4, you would, but it was just kind of like, if I have the space to play something better, I'd rather play that. Knight. Is Knight the best frontline trait ever? I'd have to think on that. It might have been. Knight might have been the best frontline trait ever. It was very good. Like, so here's the thing with this trait. It's a flat amount of damage from all sources. So unless something like insta kills you, this is always going to be useful. This essentially makes it so frontliners cannot kill your frontliner. Your frontliner will always win the frontline wars. So you have to wait till a carry actually gets on these units to kill them. But if the carry is something that's like rapidly doing damage, like say a Vayne. A Vayne's a good example here. That just kind of spams out damage the entire time. You're gonna block a lot of damage over time with this effect. Meanwhile, the like hardcore nukers of the comp that are trying to just one-shot things, there really weren't a great deal of them. Um, like I said before, a lot of the carries on this set were AD based. They were like auto attackers with maybe a light spell or something. So you got a lot of value out of this trait in this set. Um, and you could tell it kind of got kind of very relevant when people started having to make glass whispers all the time to beat anything. Legionnaire. After the rework of Legionnaire, Legionnaire felt like it was an okay trait. However, the main problem with Legionnaire is like everything on this list, with exception to Aurelia, is a carry. You can't have a trait with 6 carries in it. That's not how this works. Um, there simply weren't enough defensive champions here to make a good trade, make a good trade out of. Um, so what you ended up with was like everyone playing Aurelia, and then it was like, well, I guess I have this other Legionnaire that's useful, and just playing that. So you'd like have Draven and Aurelia, Riven and Aurelia, Kale and Aurelia. Like, you get my point here. There's nothing but damage here. There's like no healing. Fuck, I didn't turn that off. Damn it. Damn it, Ryan. Why are you messaging me? Yeah. Grumble. I feel like this should be fixed every time I do it. Alright. Back to the point. Yeah, like I said, Legionnaire, it just... There's no front line here outside of Aurelia. So playing it was always awkward. You could never really get more than 4. That said, 4 is strong. 4 is strong. This attack speed boost is high. But, this has never worked out. The nice thing about it, though, was after they fixed it, Draven was a lot more playable because he didn't, like, straight up require a Bloodthirster anymore. If you played 4 Legionnaire. Mystic, it's more interesting to talk about the Mystic champions and the traits. So when I talk about some of the specific champions of this set, we'll talk about the specific champions of this trait. Ranger. So Ranger kind of suffered. There are 2 problems with Ranger. 2. One, it kind of suffered from the same problem as Legionnaire, where everything on here was a carry, with the exception of Ashe. Ashe was probably more utility, CC bot. But everyone else here was kind of a carry. I guess you could technically say Vayne was not Vayne, Various was a trait bot, but in general, these were all carries. The other problem was how these scaled. Their scaling was just like pure attack speed, and like at some point that's just not useful anymore. Just adding more attack speed onto already a lot of attack speed just like doesn't do anything. So without a different lever here, it just never felt useful. Renewer, I think it's more relevant to talk about Renewer when the actual Renewer composition comes up later. In general, I don't think it really ever saw the light of day without a spat. Without a spat, I don't think the straight did anything. With a spat, you could do something, but without a spat, it was just really hard for this group of champions to really do anything with this trait. You know, you could get a Vlad build. There were some Vlad builds out there that I think weren't very good anyway, but in general, I think this particular trait really required a spat on specific units to be useful. Skirmisher. I played Skirmisher all day, every day. It was probably my favorite thing to play because it was... I got so good at playing it, I was just brain dead playing Fortnite Jax every game. I just did every game. I have no shame. In general, as a composition... So, when Set 5 first came out, we had Dragon Slayer. And it was pretty easy to play Skirmishers and Dragon Slayers together as one comp. When Dragon Slayer fell out, that would put a big hurt on this comp, I think. And Skirmisher wasn't that strong a comp when Set 5.5 came out. So they kind of tweaked with this attack damage buff all the time. Part of the problem with tweaking it all the time was that 3 Skirmishers was a very good early game. But like 6 Skirmisher wasn't great late game. So these numbers had to like be constantly tweaked to make this actually very good. But it was a well-designed trait because there was a good combination of champions here. You had carry champions in Olaf, Nidalee, and Jax, and they were 1 cost, 3 cost, 4 costs. While at the same time you had frontliners in Aurelia, and technically Udyr was a frontliner as well. Lee Sin, who also like provided utility, and then utility in like Kennen and Lee Sin. So there was a lot to go with here that when you compare to Legionnaire, there wasn't a lot to go off there. So I had a lot of fun with this trait. That said, it's not a very interesting trait. You play these champions, you get shield and damage. That's it. There's nothing special here. But I played it a lot, I liked it a lot, and I'd play it some more. Longline Spellweaver. I don't think Force Spellweaver was really ever a thing. Well, I guess it was. If you had a spat for Spellweaver was a thing, and sometimes you'd see it on like people who ran a Draconic opener. So they'd have all of these items on the Zyra that they might transition to a Vel'Koz later, and you'd see Force Spellweaver. So like Force Spellweaver in general is like not terrible, but 2 was utterly useless. Like it was completely terrible in the early game. Didn't do anything. Um, I do remember at one point we had Spellweaver Cavalier composition. That was a pretty decent composition. I think that kind of went away at 5.5. That was more of a set 5 comp. But yeah, the problem with Spellweaver was that like 2 Spellweaver was bad, but you didn't want to play this collection of champions to get 4, so you needed to get a spat. Um, so it was a little awkward. All right, so I'm gonna go through some of the common compositions that we saw, kind of what I thought of them, and they're loosely ordered from strongest to weakest, loosely. I don't have like official tiers. I just like kind of have them grouped together by what I thought was strong and what I thought was weak. There were also multiple ways to play them, but I'm gonna kind of go through them, kind of say what I thought, whether or not like these should be how they were played. Well, probably not along those lines. Just like how strong they were, how they should have changed, how they've changed throughout the set. Just kind of give an overview on what I thought about each of these compositions. So this first composition is Rangers. So it's Akshan, Aphelios carry. You would just pick one of these, and you'd play them with just a bunch of frontline. Like you didn't even have to play you either played a Revenant frontline or a Knight frontline. Added in Diana. Lulu Timo was something that people discovered later in the set was pretty useful. Um, but this was probably the best composition by the time the set ended. It also solidified Rage Blade as one of the most important items to make in the game. If you made a Rage Blade, you could slam this composition and just have fun. Especially if you also had a Death Blade. If you had Death Blade, Rage Blade, this was a comp you wanted to look out for. Next up, so this was A-Bomb into Vel'Koz carry. So you would take an A-Bomb composition and then transition it into a Vel'Koz composition. It wasn't that hard to do. To be honest, it was kind of a brain dead comp. Yeah, it was a pretty brain dead comp, to be honest. This was a very easy comp to build and very easy comp to play if you manage to get a transition from A-Bomb comp. Especially with these items. These items made it really easy. And these items could be held by a Zyra really easy until you found the Vel'Koz. Kind of another version of that. This was like the Heimer Teemo version of it. Generally, you would play this if you high rolled super hard on the A-Bomb opener. Then you could play either Teemo or Heimer carry. The one thing I will say about this version, Archangels on Heimer is busted. So Heimer would cast once, and once Heimer gets to his second cast, like, this always killed. This was so much damage that an Archangels did. It was kind of absurd. This always killed stuff. So, like, this was probably one of the most topped comps in the game. There wasn't much that could beat it. The main reason that Rangers would beat it is because either Aphelios or Akshan would often have pretty easy access to Heimer. Just because of how their attack spells worked. But this comp was, like, really good. Like, really, really good. 6 Sentinel. This one kind of went up and down. There were times where this was probably one of the best comps to one of the middling comps. But, in general, it was a pretty easy composition just to play Lucian carry. You could basically just play 3 Sentinels, scale up to 6 Sentinel with Lucian, and just go ham. Just go. The main interesting part with Lucian was there were so many items that worked with Lucian. You could run Deathblade on him. His best were obviously Hodge and Giant Slayer. Those were 2 of his best, along with Jewel Gauntlet was pretty good. But you could also run Deathblade. You could run Hurricane. Last Whisper is not bad. IE. I probably wouldn't run IE without Jewel Gauntlet. I think Jewel Gauntlet's probably much better than IE on him. But he just put out damage so much across the battlefield. Um, Made this comp really good, and Galio was one of the best frontliners they put in this game. Galio is like impossible to kill at times, depending on how well itemized he is. This was a very strong comp that I actually played a lot because it was pretty easy to transition around Skirmisher and Sentinel. You could kind of just like walk both lanes until you decided by finding a Lucian or finding a Jax which one you wanted to play. Misfortune Carry. Misfortune Carry was a very interesting comp throughout the set of this game. In general, I didn't think it was a very good composition. It just kind of felt very middling at times. But at the same time, it seemed like at gold and below, this was one of the best comps in the game. Because it was very easy to pilot. Oftentimes, you weren't being... Unless someone was straight up playing the same comp as you, it wasn't contested. Your units were just not contested. So it just in general became pretty easy for people to play. The only disadvantage was that Misfortune had very, very specific sets of items that were useful on her. Jewel Gauntlet, Archangels, Hodge, and Sojourn. You like needed a Sojourn and you needed an Archangels. Those were like the two items you desperately needed. I thought Hodge was also like the third item you desperately needed. This was always a very difficult composition to itemize correctly for me, because the items you needed were extremely specific. But when it worked, this was one of the best comps in the game, especially if you had a Banshee's Claw. This was really good because you could defend Misfortune for days. Draven Carry, I didn't get a chance to play this much after the rework to Draven. In general, I found that this was a hard composition to transition to because I was often playing a Skirmisher opener, and the only thing I was often carrying in the Skirmisher comp that would transition well into it was Nautilus. Nautilus and Thresh. Nautilus, Thresh, and Aurelia. So I would have to find a Hecarim in the late game after I found a Draven. It just like it never really felt, and you couldn't hit 4 without like a Vayne or a Misfortune, so it was always kind of just awkward to get up to the 4 Forgotten that was really required to play this comp. You could not play Draven without 4 Forgotten. You just couldn't do it. You were required to have 4 Forgotten and 2 Legionnaire. Otherwise, you just couldn't play this. Also, I'm questioning this Draven positioning. Because if an opponent is carrying a carry in the corner directly across, this is the thing that they'll target, and it's really bad. Jax Carry, I played this a lot. I think there was really two ways to play it. One was Fortnite Jax, which is what this one is, where you run 4 Knights and 3 Skirmishers, where your third Skirmisher is either Lee Sin or Nidalee, and you had a Viego as well. But you would either play the 4 Knight version or the 6 Skirmisher version. When they buffed 6 Skirmisher, it was okay to play 6 Skirmisher. Before that, it was not okay to play 6 Skirmisher, and you shouldn't have played 6 Skirmisher. But what made this comp, in my opinion, really strong was Ironclad. Ironclad really made this comp. This was a lot of tanky-ass champions that this comp played. Like, and that's even if you ran the 6 Skirm version, there was a lot of tanky-ass champions that were really annoying and really hard to kill. So when you add in Ironclad to that, it just kind of got miserable. This was probably my most played comp. And probably the version of it I played the most too, with Lee Sin over Nidalee. Lee Sin is probably a little more optimal over Nidalee. The one thing I will say is that if you play the 6 Skirmisher version of it, you can fit in Diana, and Diana just breaks compositions down. Diana's like really good about buying you time to scale up your Jax's attack speed. Anything that built up time for your Jax to get more attack speed was really good to have in this comp. I kind of want to take a second to like point out Jax overall as a design champion. Jax doesn't look very interesting. He doesn't do anything that's like, oh, this is busted. He doesn't. All he does is auto attack all day. But this spell makes him leap to nearest target. That was a new design I don't think we had really seen throughout the set. Was having him have a spell that made him reacquire a new target on just a frontline AD carry. We probably haven't seen that since like maybe Aurelia from set 3. Um, Either way, I played this a lot. Also, him having a defensive trait like Ironclad was kind of overkill. Just kind of. So 6 Nightbringer. So there were basically 2 ways to play 6 Nightbringer. One was Rangers, and the other was Yasuo. This is clearly the Yasuo variant. The Rangers one's a little bit different. A little bit different. Usually with this comp, I actually would not play 6 Nightbringers. I'd only play 4 because I hate playing Vladimir. I don't think Vladimir adds anything. So I would like take out Vladimir and Aphelios and then just put in probably two Cavaliers. But if I hit a Nightbringer spat, I'd throw back in Aphelios and put that Nightbringer spat on something useful. So what was interesting, Yasuo scaled like really weird. Throughout his time in this set, he scaled really weird because there was always kind of like 2 ways to have him scale. One was to have him scale via auto attacks, and the other was have him scale via his ult. So there was a point where there were basically 2 different versions of Yasuo running around. One that played off his auto attack ability, which the idea was to make him attack really fast, so he would ult a bunch of times, not for the ult to do damage, but for him to do bonus true damage with Hurricane. And that worked out well. There were a lot of people who won with that. The other way was to just Jewel Gauntlet and smash with the spell. Because it only costs 40 mana. So you can do this spell a lot. And just smash with spell damage there. I think in general, the Hurricane version was better. And I've gotten this bonus true damage to scale up astronomically with death caps. Like, kind of insanely high. The other cool thing about Yasuo was a lot of these frontline AD champions scaled very well off having a Cavalier spat, a defensive spat item. So it was pretty good. I think also it was kind of difficult to look at Yasuo throughout the duration of the set and tell he was kind of broken at times. Because I think at one point when they retooled Yasuo, oh yeah, that's right, they changed they increased the speed of the spell animation. And by doing that, they broke Yasuo. And that was hilarious. Yeah, he scaled like straight to the moon when they broke that attack when they changed that attack animation. I think they nerfed him. I even think they nerfed him knowing that it was probably going to be busted. And, he just went. This was a good comp. The only problem with this comp was it was contested a lot. A lot of people like to play this comp. So I played it a good number of times. I know a lot of people played it a good number of times. The main issue was like you couldn't play it contested and everyone was contesting it. For Invokers, I'm just gonna call this the Dawnbringer comp. Dawnbringer for Invoker comp, it kind of like came and went and came and went. There was a point where Karma was one of the best champions in the game, and they nerfed her, and it took them like 5 different buffs to bring her back to a point where she was good again. By the time set ended, she was okay. But getting to that point took a long time, and it made AP comps suffered for it. There just weren't enough good AP comps to play. But in general, this was the other issue with this comp was actually really Garen and Volibear. Without these 2 champions, this comp suffers a lot. There's just like no frontline that really does what these 2 need to be doing. Particularly Garen, because Garen reducing the magic resist for Karma carry was pretty jank. Like that kind of just ran over everything. And at the same time, Vola Bear enabled Ivern, Revenant tricks. while giving Gragas more HP. Yeah, the synergies you got at the end state with Vola Bear and Garen was so strong in this comp that it made it a little difficult to play because you could never really get to a point where you had both of these lined up and good to go. But I say that. Oh, the other issue is that Karma was useless without Invoker. You actually had to play another Invoker for Karma to do anything. Um, she did nothing without Invoker, and she did nothing without a Sojourn or a blue buff. You needed both of those things to happen in order to play Karma, and the game never really got to a state where you could play her without both. Playing without Invoker was you always played her with Invoker. There wasn't a point where you would play her without Invoker, but there were times where you would be lined up to play this comp and you just didn't hit you didn't hit a tier, so you could never make a blue buff or a Sojourn. It was just like, how do I play an AP comp without a blue buff or Sojourn? And you sit there and you think and you realize, oh shit, I can't. And that was a particularly big problem with Karma, because without that blue buffer Sojourn, Karma did no damage at all. Whereas a Vel'Koz or a Heimer at least stood a chance. Karma didn't. And that's part of the reason why this comp was so feast or famine. This was a very feast or famine comp. Gwen Carey, I'm not going to talk about it. This was a pretty much high roll. You get an early Gwen, you itemize her with blue buff and Gunblade, and she goes ham. You could really just run anything. Just this particular one was just like tanky ass frontline in the Gwen inanimate buff. But in general, Gwen was incredibly strong with blue buff Gunblade. Like very very strong. Kale. So there was a Kale basically went pretty much all of set 5, the original set 5, being Garbo tier. Absolute Garbo tier. It eventually got to a point where we discovered Fortnite Kale, where you would just run. Well, it really wasn't Fortnite, it was 6 Night Kale. You just run 6 nights with Kale and just let Kale go off from there. After they rebalanced Kale for like the 50th time, Kale came back into the light, but was brutally overpowered. um, Kale's scaling with Deathblade was way too hard. So they pulled out a lot of Kale's damage that she would get scaling off AD, and I recall they made it just set damage. I don't think they made it AP. I think they just pulled out the AD and just made it straight damage. And that kind of nullified the comp. It made it not as good to play anymore, and this kind of became a B. Like we're in the B tier comps right now. Um, it just never. Kale didn't really recover that well from that changeover. I think it would probably have been better had they not made that change and just stuck with old Kale, particularly because of how saturated the game became with Rage Blades. Nearly every comp was asking for a Rage Blade. So since those got so hard contested, this just became hard to play. Hellion Triss Carry. A lot of people, including myself, complained about this composition. This composition kind of ran over mid games like really hard. Trist was like impossible to kill. So when Trist had like a bloodthirster and a hurricane, Trist has like destroyed everything in sight, and there just wasn't anything anyone could do about it. There was no comps that could really handle Trist well. So they eventually reworked Trist, and this comp went to crap. Like you can't even play this comp now. Six Assassin. Um, my thoughts on this comp. You don't play this comp without a spat at this point. There was a point you could play this comp without a spat, but now you at the point the game is at now, you can't play it without a spat. In the mid game, it was probably fine, but when you got to the late game, not being able to just instantly murder things off became a significant problem. Um, Also, Nocturne Nocturne eventually became a mistake. They kind of kept changing the way Nocturne damage scaled to the point that he just stopped scaling with leveling. He just kind of scaled with items and just pure stats. The spell did not scale anymore. He had no spell scaling at all. The spell was always the same. And I thought that was just like very awkward and like not very good. But the main thing with this comp was without a spat, like no one could play it anymore. You could play it before at 4 assassins, but you needed 6 as the set further developed. Vayne Carey is interesting. So in my experience, I call this composition a nice second place comp. This is a second place comp. It rarely ever wins, but it almost always top fours. And in general, that's because Knight front lines don't usually come online until the late mid game, where Vayne would have a lot of trouble against. So before that, a lot of people are still usually playing Brawlers, or sometimes they're playing Cavalier, but they're often like only playing 2 Knights. They're not going to play 4 Knights on you, where this comp would hard struggle against. Another problem I found with this comp after I played it like 3 or 4 times, a lot of people don't really understand what the important items to this composition are. There are 3 core items: Zeke's, Rageblade, and Hurricane. The most important of these is Zeke's. It is not Rageblade, it is not Hurricane, it is Zeke's. You cannot play this comp without Zeke's. I played this like 3 or 4 times, and the difference with and without Zeke's is, but it's very set on those 3 items. You have to play those 3 items, and Zeke's is one of the first items you need to be making. Also, my frontline Hecarim always sucked compared to everyone else. Just, anytime I went up against my opponent's Hecarim, I couldn't kill it. And then I'd run the same Hecarim with the same set of items, and it just got blown up. And I was always angry about that. Kled Carry, everyone's favorite composition. Kled gets a lot of hate. I think this comp was actually fine. I don't think this comp like ever won. Like, this is another one of those. This is a second place comp. You're never going to win. But I think people eventually just kind of got upset with Kled and his falling off the horse, de-aggroing, and that being frustrating to play around. In general, after they nerfed Kled after the World Championships, this kind of fell off a cliff. I don't think anyone played it. But it was annoying for a time. Also, he needed Last Whisper and Hurricane. Without those 2 items, you couldn't play this. Oh, the Kalista Aatrox carry. This was a thing for like a day, where people would just re-roll Aatrox and Kalista. I tried this. What I found is you need these 3 exact items on Aatrox for this composition to work. These are whatever. These 3 items are required. And then you just stack all of whatever damage items you find on Kalista. The problem with this was after they changed Aatrox healing, you couldn't play this anymore. He just didn't get enough healing. Without more significant amount of healing, you could easily kill Aatrox. And this comp fell off a wagon, so no one played it anymore. Various carry. I saw too many people play this comp. At times they shouldn't be playing it. This is one of the weakest comps in the game. This is a maybe I top 4 comp. But I say that this is a good transitionary comp. You can actually play this and then transition into Kale carry. These items all go pretty well on Kale. You can have Rageblade, Hurricane. I wouldn't worry about the Hurricane. Rageblade, Hodge. Just transition that to Kale, and this would have been a fine comp to play. The reason I think this shows up is because most people died with it at 4th. This is a you might make 4th comp. 6. Okay, so this is Chug Bug. Cool thing about Chug Bug. I think Chug Bug was always good, but it wasn't really discovered until like 3/4 of the way through set 5.5. People discovered Chug Bug. I also don't think this was a 1st place comp. This was 2nd place comp. But the idea here being that you had this super tanky Gragas, you had 6 Dawnbringer, and you had this Kha'Zix that never went away. And eventually this Kha'Zix, if it wasn't killed, it would just kind of like murder an entire composition slowly over time. Starting with the backline. So the idea is all the frontline stuff would aggro on Gragas, and they would all walk up on Gragas, and that would leave an isolated backline for Kha'Zix to like feast on. And then you just slowly work your way through the comp while Gragas just took damage. Now, eventually it was kind of nerfed, if I recall. I can't remember. Oh, they changed the isolation damage, which was only relevant to like the highest health champions. I guess the last thing I'll say, I don't think these items are right. I don't even think you need IE. The isolation damage is so high, I don't think you need IE. I think the best versions of this ISOL ran RFC, Hodge, and GA. Those were all like good items to have on him. All right, 3 more to go. So this, remember I was talking about the Renewer trait, and like I was gonna hold that off till I got to the composition. This is the composition. So Renewer in general is pretty bad. Just standalone, not gonna talk anything else. It's just not very good. But on a champion like Nunu, Renewer is ridiculous. It's also pretty good on Vola Bear, but on Nunu, it's particularly grotesque. With this combination of items here, Nunu was probably one of the better champions in the game. He just instant healed up, had infinity HP. This was kind of out of control at times. The problem often was like, how do you get to this point? Often it's like you're playing an opener with Dawnbringer, but you don't. These aren't the items that I would have to play. Like we're ignoring the Soraka because I don't think I'd ever like focus on itemizing Soraka. What you need is these 3 items, and outside of Warmogs, you're probably not going to slam a Renewer Spat or a Gunblade. So you end up with like flexible items, and then maybe you hit a Spat, and then you're like, do I play Nunu from here? And just like how you get to this point is just kind of awkward. That said, I actually think this is a pretty strong composition, as long as your Nunu doesn't like get insta one-shot. So I'm gonna like split this one in half. The Riven Nidalee carry. There was a point in 5.5 where Riven and Nidalee carry 3-starring was very strong, and they eventually fell off a cliff. The scaling on them was like literally thrown off the wagon and over a cliff and into a empty creek riverbed. So like this wasn't really that good. This isn't that good now at all. Like this is actually pretty terrible comp. But it's worth mentioning that there's all sorts of ways that you can hit. Like it's literally these 2 champions plus whatever else you felt like playing. Normally in Aurelia, I used to play a lot of skirmishers. This used to be kind of a 6 skirm comp for me, where I would play 6 skirms and have a Riven, and that was 7 units, and that was my comp. Not very uncommon for me to play like that. But like I said, they put a bunch of nerfs on Riven and Nidalee, and you just couldn't re-roll this anymore. But it was probably the top comp when it was played. Any individual champions I want to take a moment to talk about that we hadn't talked about? Nautilus was the best 2-cost unit in the game. I played him in pretty much every single comp I played. Unless I was playing a Cavalier frontline, Nautilus was in my frontline pretty much every time. He had a great ult. He has Ironclad. He has Knight, so he's super tanky. Great unit. Same thing with Aurelia. Aurelia's traits are just absurd. You have Sentinel, Legionnaire, and Skirmisher. So she heals, she gets a shield, and she gets a shield. Great unit. Syndra was one of the most frustrating champions in the game, in my opinion. Just like protected back. I think she protected backlines too well. It was really hard to kill backlines when Syndra was like freely throwing your assassins off things. Thresh. Thresh's damage was too high throughout a large portion of this set. Just way too high. He also had a bug where if he cast his spell and then died, that stun effect was like still there. And that was also frustrating to deal with. But he was also like one of the better tanks in the game. He generally would hold until like stage 7 for me. Lee Sin was a good champion. He also like took emblems very well. Like there was like an unlimited amount of emblems you could put on him that was effective. Lulu, I'm glad they eventually nerfed Lulu. This Lulu is basically the same Lulu that they had in set 3. That was a 5-cost unit, and this was a 3-cost unit. They eventually nerfed it and got it right. Once they fixed the scaling on Lux, Lux was fine. But the scaling on Lux, particularly in pre-set 5.5, was a little obnoxious. Anything else? Rakan. Rakan was probably the most underrated champion in the set. Mostly the reason that he was underrated is because his trait classing was, his traits were like bad. Like you would basically only play him in Sentinel. But as just like a straight unit, was actually pretty strong. Diana was secretly one of the best champions in this set. The amount of damage she did by just displacing backlines was kind of crazy. Like, that was a huge stun that she put down. Ironclad, Lucian, Rel. Rel was probably one of the most all-purpose frontline units in the game, providing a stun and a shield to, like, your carry in a corner. Like, pretty good unit. Action. Like, Action was just such a good, like, generic unit, like, unitemized. Same thing with Ivern. Both Ivern and Action were just really good at unitemized for, like, different reasons. Because Ivern was CC, but Action, like, did a lot of good damage unitemized. Particularly, like, and he would do his swing where he did so much damage. Like, he was a really good champion. Kind of talked about Garen and Gwen. Teemo. I hate Teemo. Actually, I love Teemo. I just hate this version of Teemo. I think Cruel was overkill, to be honest. I like the idea of sacrificing health instead of gold to pick him up, but that also made it like really difficult to come back in a game where you're playing Invoker. Like, you basically could not come back with Invoker because of the fact it cost health to play Teemo. But it was interesting. I think if it cost like less health, but he wasn't a 5-cost, probably would have been okay. But you would have had to get rid of Cruel, because Cruel would not work outside of a 5-cost, and I hate Cruel. Especially Cruel combined with Hellion, because that made it so that after you kill Teemo, a new one would come in its place. And that still had... Well, after they fixed it, because it wasn't originally like this. Cruel would not proc on the second Teemo, but they eventually fixed that so it did proc off the second Teemo, and that made Teemo very good. Viego. Oh, Viego. Alright, so I'm going to kind of keep this simple. Viego functions as both a CC and a damage unit. Because his ult CCs his target for 5 seconds. That's a long CC. That's almost a, oh shoot. The worldly thing. Wow, I'm blanking right now. I've been playing too long. It's here. I can look it up. It is here, right? There it is. Zephyr. Yeah. So Zephyr CCs for, how long does it say? 5 seconds. This is literally a Zephyr. This ult. Plus, it deals damage, so it will eventually kill the champion. And if it kills the champion, it's resurrected as your unit. That's a lot of stuff this does. Also, if you look at the damage that he's doing, if you get him up to 2-star, it is a lot of damage. I've found that very specific items on Viego are also like really strong. Gunblade in particular is very strong. Having Assassin triggered with him is very strong because his ult can then crit. So I played Diana Viego a lot. A lot, a lot. A lot, a lot, a lot, a lot. It was one of my go-to combinations of late game units. Um, Plus, Viego also scaled off Forgotten. So getting that additional AP off the Forgotten trait was ridiculous. There were too many levers to make Viego incredibly strong. And his spell alone was incredibly frustrating. I hope we never see Viego again, because he was a pain to position against, he was a pain to fight against, and would instantly sway an entire battle with a single ult. More so than the next champion I'll talk about, Vola Bear, who had one of the most obnoxious stuns in the game. You can kind of ignore the part about shields. This stun was just so big. Like, anytime an opponent had a Vola Bear, you had to position around it. You always had to position around it. Because if you didn't, you risked your entire composition getting CC'd. And that was bad. You did not want that. That was bad. You didn't want that. He also had Revenant, which functioned as an aggro drop after which would naturally happen either just before or just after he ulted, so he would get another ult again. It was so frustrating to play against. You do a lot of work to make sure your composition is not ulted by Vola Bear, only for it to be ulted anyway. He was hard to play around, and you had to play around him. Anyway, that's it for set 5.5. My kind of overall thoughts on 5.5. The change from set 5 to 5.5 was great. It made the game so much better. I actually really liked it. But there were some base issues with set 5 that just simply couldn't be resolved. Most notably, in my opinion, I think that the actual traits themselves were kind of dull and boring. I think the 5 costs overall were pretty interesting. I think particularly like Garen, Gwen, like even Viego and Vola Bear, they were interesting 5 cost champions to play. Not as cool as set 4 set. Lol. But still like very interesting, fun to play. Good units. I think there were a lot of great compositions throughout the lifespan of this set, and via patching, a lot of different compositions saw the light of day. The only issue was that there were a couple sets that via patching like kind of needed to be premier compositions throughout the duration of the set and just weren't. Most notably, everything involving Karma. And some of the 3-cost carries like Riven and Yasuo, they would like pop up and then disappear. Same with Nidalee, they just like pop up and then disappear, while they probably should have been more standard. I also think there weren't enough reroll. I think the only real rerolls were Kha'Zix and Vayne. I think those were really the only ones that were any good. But overall, because of the changes, I mean, I'd give this a solid B+ set. It would have been an A if set 5 like had better traits, I think, or if they kept Dragon Slayer. If they kept Dragon Slayer, they would have been an A. But I'd be pretty happy if I was right where 5.5 ended up, where it landed. The changes they made just made it a significantly better set. And I was quite happy how this set ended up. So I'm gonna go ahead and end this video and start working on my next one. I shall see you all around.